Now, this is a review of Chapter 21 that talks about water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. It really is a combination of a little bit about from the urinary system and the respiratory system and how those two act together in order to regulate our water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. So we'll talk about the whole concept of balance. Really, it means, that our intake of these things it would be equal to the output. Okay, and as you've seen throughout the different chapters, that there is always, water and electrolytes go hand in hand because they are interdependent. So there has to be a balance that we can use different mechanisms in order to compensate for the loss of water or compensate for the loss of these electrolytes. Okay, and that state of balance is maintained through different homeostatic mechanisms that we are going to be talking about here. First off, let's understand how our body fluids distributed. How is water distributed throughout the body? So we have the different compartments. The majority of our fluids are found inside of the cell, and that is known as intracellular fluid. So intracellular fluid makes about 63% of our body fluids, while the remaining 37% are found outside of the cells, known as extracellular fluid. And there is a movement so that these fluids are not constant. There is a constant movement of fluids in between these compartments. If you go by weight, the average adult female is about 52% water by weight, while male is about 63% water by weight. And the reason that the percentage in male is higher is due to the, on average, higher, more muscle mass, which is higher in water, while in females there's more adipose tissue, which is less in water. Throughout the whole body, there's about 40 liters of water with a whole bunch of ions and electrolytes that are dissolved in them, and they are distributed among these two compartments. If we take a look at, this bigger picture, again, you can see your intracellular fluid, which is the fluid inside of the cells, makes about 63%, while the remaining 37% are found outside of the cell. So where do we find, the majority of that would be what is known as your interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid found between cells or between tissue. Followed by plasma, so that is the fluid that is found in found in our blood vessels. Followed by the amount of fluid found in our lymph. And then the whatever is remaining is found in what is known as transcellular fluid. Transcellular fluid would be different parts of the body that have fluid and they are surrounded by an epithelial sac. For example, the synovial fluid, which is the joint fluid found inside of our joints, or the fluid found in the eye, like the vitreous humor or the aqueous humor, or the CSF. Okay, so all of these different fluids that are contained in smaller compartments all of them collectively are known as transcellular fluid. Now, if you want to take a look at the electrolytes, okay, the electrolytes that are found extracellularly, the most important cation or positive ion would be sodium, while the most important negative ion or anion is chloride. When it comes to intracellular fluid, the most important positive ion is potassium, and the most important negative ion would be phosphates. Now, we said that these fluids are not constant. They are actually constantly moving between different compartments. So they're not, they don't just stand there. They're not, I can't find the word for it, but they're not stagnant fluids, okay? They actually keep on going from one compartment to the next. And the movement of fluid is regulated by these two different pressures. Hydrostatic pressure, that is dependent on the movement of water molecules, hence the name hydro from water. So hydrostatic pressure, And the other one is osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure is pressure that is based on the presence of plasma proteins. So if you look at this blood vessel right here, hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that is exerted by water on the walls of the capillaries or on the walls of the blood vessels. And hydrostatic pressure would help in filtration out of the capillary, while osmotic pressure would be due to the presence of plasma proteins that is going to pull water into the capillary. So these are two opposing pressures. Hydrostatic pressure is a pressure that would help push things away, while osmotic pressure, due to the plasma proteins, that would be pulling water towards the plasma proteins. Now, water balance, again, this is something that is very variable from one person to another. Even, within the same individual, throughout the day, we have different water needs depending on water intake and water output, and even environmental factors like temperature, for example. But there has to be a homeostasis between water intake and water output. So let's take a look at the major ways that we intake water. Okay, obviously the majority of our water comes from beverages, from drinking. Some water comes from moist food, and we also make water out of metabolism. So, a lot of the metabolic products, metabolic reactions that our body performs, water would be end products in a lot of these reactions. So this is where our average daily intake of water would be. Obviously, again, the vast majority would be by drinking beverages. Your average daily output of water, you'll lose most water by urination, followed by water loss through skin, through perspiration and lungs in the form of water vapor. We also lose some water in feces, and then water in sweat. These, again, are very, they could change depending on physical activity, depending on environmental temperature, and so on. Now, where is the thirst center in the body? The thirst center is found in the hypothalamus, and that is the center that is going to control the amount of water we intake. So water intake is controlled by your thirst center in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has osmoreceptors. They detect changes in plasma osmolality, meaning the concentration of plasma. Is the plasma concentrated or is it diluted? That is what osmoreceptors detect. There is an osmoreceptor ADH mechanism in the hypothalamus. So again, when we detect the osmolality of plasma, the amount of ADH that is going to be produced by the posterior pituitary depends on the osmolality of plasma. So that is going to regulate eventually the concentration of urine produced in the kidneys. Remember when we talked about when we discussed the urinary system, we said that ADH is going to increase the reabsorption of water in the distal tubules and in the collecting ducts. And we said that it is due to the stimulation of the osmoreceptors that are found in the hypothalamus. Now, what about electrolyte balance and regulation of electrolyte output? So up here, you could see where is the intake. How do we get electrolytes or salts? We get them from food, or we drink them in the form of fluids, or again, our metabolic reactions that happen inside of our body. All of these are different inputs on how we get our electrolytes. In order to get rid of electrolytes, we get rid of it through perspiration or through feces and urine. Now, some electrolytes are more important than others, so you'll find that some hormones are kind of dedicated to maintain these levels constant. For example, calcium ions are regulated mainly by parathyroid hormone. And then you have potassium and sodium ions are regulated through the actions of ADH and aldosterone. Now for the acid-base balance. So acid by definition is anything that when you dissolve in water, okay, it will give you hydrogen ions. Okay, while a base are substances that when you dissolve in water, they would give you an ion, which is an OH or the hydroxyl group, that can combine with the hydrogen ion to make a water molecule. And the more acidic the solution is, the lower its pH. So pH is a range, is a scale that ranges from 0 to 14. 7, which is right in the middle, is considered neutral, and that would be distilled water, for example. Okay, anything below 7 would be acidic, anything above 7 would be alkalinic. The normal pH of our body lies between 7.35 to 7.45. So this is a value that you want to be familiar with. So you see that our body's is usually a little bit on the alkalinic side. And this right here will show you what are the sources of hydrogen ions inside of our body. So you'll find that there are lots and lots of metabolic reactions in our body, and the majority of them end up making different kinds of acids. So for example, glucose breakdown, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic. In aerobic respiration of glucose or aerobic oxidation of glucose, we end up making carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. In the anaerobic respiration of glucose, we end up making lactic acid. And both of these you see here are acidic products that are going to increase the hydrogen ions inside of our bodies. The incomplete oxidation of fatty acids release ketone bodies, which are acidic. The oxidation of amino acids that contain sulfur will end up making sulfuric acid, while the hydrolysis of phosphoprotein and nucleic acid end up making phosphoric acid. And here again is that average normal pH range of our arterial blood, 7.35 to 7.45. The whole survival range of our body is 6.8 to all the way to 8. So you'll see here that we don't have a huge survival range when it comes to changes in pH, and that's why our body has different mechanisms to make sure that our pH remains within a normal value. If you go underneath 7.35, the body is now in a condition known as acidosis. If it is above 7.45, that means the body is in a condition of alkalosis. Now we were talking about the different, buffer systems that help maintain pH homeostasis. Again, a lot of the metabolic reactions in our body, as we've seen, are going to eventually make acids, and that is going to add lots of hydrogen ions and decrease the pH. So we have to make sure that there's a way our body can eliminate the effects of these acids. So we have 3 different ways. Chemical buffer system, and that's the fastest. Okay, but it has a limited ability. Basically what it does is that these different chemicals are going to change stronger acids into weaker acids, or a strong base into a weaker base. So you've helped a little bit, but you still have that a little bit of acid and a little bit of base. But again, it's a very fast acting buffer system. Second, these 2 are known as physiological. We can actually go down here. Physiological systems, and that would be respiratory excretion of carbon dioxide. Remember that infamous equation, well, CO2 dissolves in water to make H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. Okay, so if we are able to get rid of carbon dioxide through hyperventilation, so respiratory excretion of carbon dioxide, if you wash off or get rid of more carbon dioxide, you're basically getting rid of H2CO3, which is an acid. Or, and this takes about minutes in order to produce an effect. Renal excretion of hydrogen ions. So when we talked about the renal system, we said that we have our nephrons in the distal tubules have the ability to secrete hydrogen ions when needed. So that renal excretion of hydrogen ions is also a way of eliminating acids. This takes a couple of days, though, to produce an effect. So these are kind of in the order of how fast they are. So chemical buffer system is the fastest, respiratory excretion takes about minutes, and then renal excretion takes days to produce an effect. Okay, so these are your chemical buffer systems, either bicarbonate buffer or phosphate buffer system or a protein buffer system. And again, what they do is take strong acids or strong bases and change them into weaker acids or weaker bases. Second line of defense are your physiological ones, which are respiratory mechanisms, either increasing or decreasing the rate and depth of respiration in order to eliminate carbon dioxide, and that it takes about minutes to produce an effect, while renal mechanism or increase of renal excretion of hydrogen ions, that takes days in order to produce an effect. Here you can see the different acid-base imbalances. So we've got acidosis or alkalosis, and we said that acidosis means that the pH of the blood is less than 7.35, and you want to be familiar with these definitions and these numbers. So how is it that our body can become acidotic? Either we have an accumulation of acids, or we're losing the base. Okay, so that means that there is a relative increase in concentration of hydrogen ions. While in alkalosis, the pH would be higher than 7.5, again, a number you want to be familiar with. And in order for the body to become alkalotic, that means that we're either losing too much acid or there's an accumulation of base. The two different kinds of acidosis, we'll talk about acidosis first. There is respiratory and metabolic acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is an acidosis due to a respiratory cause. So there's an accumulation of CO2 and H2CO3, which is that carbonic acid, due to a pathology in the respiratory system. So it could be due to decreased rate and depth of breathing, so there's hypoventilation, or there's an obstruction of the air passages, or there's a decrease in gas exchange, for example, maybe in pneumonia cases. So that will lead to accumulation of carbon dioxide in the body, leading to respiratory acidosis. Metabolic acidosis would be an accumulation of acid due to any other reason in the body except for respiratory causes. Okay, so we usually call them accumulation of non-respiratory acids. It could be, for example, due to kidney failure. Now the kidney is unable to excrete those acids, or excessive production of these ketone bodies, which are acidic in the case of diabetic patients. So diabetic ketoacidosis leading to accumulation of these acids. Another cause would be due to the excessive loss of base. For instance, prolonged diarrhea. Diarrhea has a lot of the alkalinic secretions that were made by the intestinal cells. So prolonged diarrhea with loss of that alkalinic intestinal secretion can lead to now relative increase in hydrogen ions, or prolonged vomiting. So vomiting, the gastric juice is acidic, but prolonged vomiting would mean that not only did we get rid of the gastric contents, but we are also getting rid of intestinal contents through vomiting, and that leads to loss of these intestinal secretions that are again alkalinic. For alkalosis, there are two different reasons of it or types. Again, respiratory alkalosis, and this has to do with the excess loss of carbon dioxide or H2CO3 due to respiratory reasons. And you'll find that all of them, what they have in common would be hyperventilation. So when a person hyperventilates, they are washing out lots of carbon dioxide. For example, in anxiety or panic attacks, fever, poisoning, different poisons. Some poisons can lead to hyperventilation. High altitudes, again, that hyperventilation is going to lead to excess loss of carbon dioxide, which translates into a decrease in blood levels of H2CO3, which translates into low levels of hydrogen ions or high pHs, and that is a respiratory alkalosis. In metabolic alkalosis, which are due to excess loss of hydrogen ions due to any other cause besides respiratory, it could be a gastric lavage or gastric drainage, vomiting with loss of gastric secretions only, Or some diuretics can also lead to that loss of the non-respiratory acids that will lead to metabolic acidosis. Or if somebody takes excessive amounts of antacids, okay, that can lead to, now we've got too much base accumulated in their bloodstream, and that leads to metabolic acidosis, alkalosis. Okay. And that concludes this chapter.